is Success Stories, a program of the Sorrell College of Business. I'm your host, Alan Mendenhall, Associate Dean of the Sorrell College of Business and Executive Director of the Manuel H. Johnson Center for Political Economy. Success Stories is a program that highlights the lives and careers of people who have accomplished great things. My guest today is Zack Smith, a Senior Legal Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Zack, great to have you here on the show.
Well, great to be with you. Thank you for having me on.
Well, I want to start by letting you plug your book because I know you just published a book in June. We're sitting here right now in April. So tell us about the book and what you've learned in the process of writing it.
Well, I appreciate that, Alan. You know, my background is as a former federal prosecutor, and so when I got to the Heritage Foundation, I continued to research and write on criminal justice issues. And so unfortunately, I found out there's actually a group of prosecutors who have pledged not to prosecute entire categories of crimes. And so one of my colleagues and I, my colleague who's also a former federal prosecutor, we wrote a book called Rogue Prosecutors: How Radical Soros Lawyers Are Destroying America's Communities. And it talks about the Marxist ideological underpinnings of this movement. It talks about what the goals of the movement are, what the policies are, and then it highlights the real-world impact of these policies and how they end up harming victims and harming the communities wherever they've been implemented.
And what are some of those goals?
Well, I think if you look at what many of the academic supporters of this movement say, they tell you their goal is to, quote, fundamentally reimagine our criminal justice system, to tear it down and to build it back in something new and different. And fundamentally, Alan, the underpinnings of this movement go back to something called the prison abolition movement. If you can believe it, there's actually a movement started in Berkeley and some other left-wing institutions in the 1960s, 1970s, that thinks nobody should go to prison for essentially any reason. And you can imagine that didn't play very well with the public when it was first put out. But what's happening today, unfortunately, is that many of the goals of that movement are being realized through this rogue prosecutor movement in terms of not sending people to prison, even people who commit very violent crimes like rape, robbery, and homicide.
And so your time as a federal prosecutor was in Florida. Were you in the Northern District of Florida?
I was.
And prior to your time as a federal prosecutor, you were in private practice, correct?
I was.
In D.C. What were you doing in private practice? What areas?
Sure. So very different from being a federal prosecutor. I was doing structured finance work, also doing a little bit of litigation in securities and antitrust, but kind of a very niche type of practice that really didn't let me see the inside of a courtroom too much. And so that's one of the things I appreciated about going to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Not only did I get to do what I thought was a good public service in terms of serving my community, helping to protect the community, but also getting some real-world trial experience and getting to take a case from soup to nuts. Essentially, if I wanted to handle a case a certain way, I was generally allowed to do that, and I very much appreciated having that broad freedom.
So you enjoyed that transition from private practice to government work and being the prosecutor. Yeah,
very much so.
And you are from Florida? I know you've got some Alabama ties. I want to ask you about those in a minute, but are you from Florida?
I am. I'm a native Pensacolian. Pensacola is home. It's where my family is. It's where my wife's family is from as well. And so the Panhandle of Florida is home for me.
Yeah, I suppose once you start in the Panhandle, it's probably hard to leave it. It's a nice place to be.
Well, I am partial, but I think we have the world's best beaches there on the Gulf Coast. But it's certainly a very nice place to be.
And you clerked for the 11th Circuit and were stationed here in Alabama, correct? You were in Mobile.
That's right. I clerked right after law school. I had the very fortunate opportunity to clerk for Judge Emmett Cox on the 11th Circuit, and he sat in Mobile. And I can't say enough good things about Judge Cox. He was the a consummate gentleman, a consummate judge, really took his work very seriously. And I really learned a lot from Judge Cox during my year clerking for him. And also had the opportunity to travel the circuit with him, the 11th Circuit, and hear oral arguments here in Montgomery, also in Atlanta, Jacksonville, and Miami. And it's just a phenomenal experience all around.
And you studied at the University of Florida.
Go Gators.
Go Gators. Bachelor's, math. You got to be careful throwing that around out here in Alabama sometimes.
I know. Although I don't think our football team has been good enough lately for me to say that too loudly.
Well, I'm very pleased with some of your administrative changes. I'm excited to see Ben Sass
Right.
as president. I think he'll do some interesting things, and I think exciting things are happening in Florida just more generally. What was your master's degree in?
Political science.
Okay.
And so I wasn't quite sure after I graduated undergrad, had degrees in political science and history, if I wanted to go to law school, if I maybe wanted to pursue a different path. And so I spent a year studying for my master's degree and ultimately decided I did want to go to law school, and so was able to stay at Florida and complete my law degree there as well.
Explain what you do now for the Heritage Foundation.
Sure. So it's been a transition from actually practicing either in private practice or at the U.S. Attorney's Office. I'm not litigating cases right now, but I am much more focused on the policy side of things. And so my average day at the Heritage Foundation can look very different. Some days I have the opportunity to come out and talk to folks like you, which I very much enjoy. I get to talk to students around the country, get to talk to members of state legislatures, members of Congress. And as a 501c3, you know, obviously Heritage doesn't lobby. We do policy, not politics. But I have been able to engage in some very important policy debates, particularly in the criminal justice space, which I research and write on, but also in other areas too, election integrity, First Amendment, religious liberty issues as well. And so it's been a very rewarding experience so far at the Heritage Foundation.
I would imagine certain days involve just a great degree of studying and reading up and catching up on new trends and reading cases and reading news articles and staying up to date on all the latest information.
Right, absolutely. Well, one of the things Heritage has been kind enough to allow me to do with another one of my colleagues is host a Supreme Court focused podcast called SCOTUS 101. You can find it on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. But we recap what's happening at the Supreme Court, where we talk about oral arguments that have happened, we analyze decisions that have come down, and just try to give an overview of what's happening at the court. And so if any of your viewers are interested in what's happening at the Supreme Court, I hope they'll check out the podcast called SCOTUS 101.
Well, let's talk about a particular issue, because I actually heard you speak earlier in the day, and you were speaking about DEI, and I made the comment to you that DEI almost represents the opposite of what it's supposed to stand for. The D is supposed to mean diversity, but in fact it means uniformity, specifically of thought.
Right.
The E stands for equity, which involves inequality, because it's equity and equality are actually in tension with one another. And inclusion requires exclusion of viewpoints that you consider to be outside the acceptable scope.
Right.
And so DEI is actually a very exclusive, very negative acronym. In its operations, it is also very negative.
Right.
Talk about what's going on with DEI in the courts, or what you anticipate will go on with DEI in the courts. Here in Alabama, we just had a sort of a controversial bill pass into law. And I know after the Harvard and North Carolina cases, a lot of companies and firms in the private sector are trying to figure out what they need to do in light of the Supreme Court's decision. Right. So what are the trends that you anticipate coming from the courts regarding DEI?
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this because, look, I think DEI is a harmful policy, a harmful ideology wherever it's been implemented. I think it's important to understand that it's fundamentally a Marxist-based concept. This idea that we need to tear down existing legal and social structures and, again, reimagine them as something new and different. And this idea of equity over equality is harmful because, as you said, it doesn't involve treating everyone equally, regardless of their race or their gender or their religion, things that I think we all should hold very near and dear. It actually involves treating people differently based on their race in particular. And while the proponents of this idea say they're doing it for good reasons or there's such a thing as benign discrimination, that's just not the case. Any type of discrimination, anytime you're treating someone differently based on their race or gender or religion or any of those other protected characteristics, it's a very harmful, very bad thing. And it's harmful and bad wherever it's implemented. We've seen a lot of it in higher education. We've seen a lot of it in corporate America. But what particularly concerns me is we're seeing it increasingly in court systems across the country. And the reason I find this so troubling is because where do we go? when government entities have violated our rights. We traditionally, as Americans, go to the court to protect and enforce our constitutional guarantees. And so when court systems themselves say they are going to treat people differently based on race, either in terms of hiring or in terms of whether or not they'll hear oral argument in a particular case, that's very, very troubling, and I think very hard to square with, as you mentioned, the U.S. Supreme Court's decisions in the Harvard and UNC cases, where they essentially struck down the affirmative action programs at those schools, and where Chief Justice Roberts, writing for the court, and Justice Clarence Thomas, writing separately, made clear that there is no such thing as benign or good discrimination. But I think this trend, unfortunately, is here to stay in state courts and in federal courts to some extent as well.
How did we get from Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream that people would be judged by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin, to the point where an immutable characteristic, something that you can't choose, something that you're born with, like your race, is now the defining quality for who you are as a person? That's sort of essentially what DEI is predicated on, is the notion that certain people are conferred special status because of the color of their skin, and that discrimination against people, for example, Asians in admissions processes at universities, it's acceptable to discriminate against them because the color of their skin is different and there's a different proportional representation. How did we get from MLK to that?
It's a great question, and one I think, frankly, we should all be asking ourselves as Americans. And I think, unfortunately, many people have bought into the idea that there can be such a good thing as benign or good discrimination. You can treat people differently based on race if you're doing it to help that person, supposedly. I think that's very misguided, to put it mildly. I think actually many times, as was discussed in the Harvard and UNC cases, these programs actually end up being extremely harmful, even to the individuals they're supposed to help. But if we go back to the court context specifically, when we think about it, courts are supposed to do equal justice under the law. But how can they do that if the very judges who are sitting and deciding these cases with these very important issues, when they turn around and hire their own court staff, when they hire their own deputies and other lower level court employees, how can they be expected to impartially rule on the merits of these cases if they themselves, in their own hiring practices, are discriminating on the basis of race, even if it's done for supposedly good reasons?
Well, I want to ask a little lighter question, which is involves where you work within the Heritage Foundation. You're actually in the Ed Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies. Have you had the opportunity to meet Ed Meese?
I have talked to Mr. Meese. He is a phenomenal man and a great American. And he is in his 90s at this point, but he is still actively involved in current legal happenings. In fact, he just had a brief filed on his behalf at the U.S. Supreme Court in the Trump litigation, talking about some very important separation of powers issues. And so I think, Mr. Meese is one of our nation's greatest attorney generals, and certainly deserves a lot of credit, particularly for recommitting many Americans and many lawyers to the idea that the text of the Constitution matters. A lot of people don't give Ed Meese enough credit for really pushing back against this idea of living constitutionalism and being at the forefront of introducing or reintroducing the idea of originalism back into our public legal discourse.
I think that's right. I had a wonderful opportunity to meet Ed Meese in 2011 at a Philadelphia Society meeting in Memphis. I think it was 2011.
Okay.
It was in the range of 2011, I'll put it that way. And it was at the Peabody Hotel in Memphis where the little ducks do their march. And he spoke, and I went up to say some words to him afterwards, and I was, who was I? Some little young guy. He didn't have to give me the time of day, but he did. And there was a line forming. A lot of people wanted to meet him. And he talked to me for longer than I ever deserved, and was engaged and happy. The people lined behind me may not have been so happy, but he went one by one and talked to each person and was tremendously charismatic, was so kind and so gracious and thoughtful, and I was very impressed. Interestingly, this tie that I have on is an Adam Smith tie created by the Leadership Institute.
Okay.
And the Leadership Institute was told, actually, Ed Meese told the Leadership Institute, told Morton Blackwell, you need an Adam Smith tie in green. And he said, okay, we'll go make an Adam Smith tie in green. They made it. It was a very different design, and they brought it back to Ed Meese, and they said, here you go, Ed, here's your Adam Smith tie in green. And he said, that's ugly. That's the ugliest tie I've ever seen. And you need to make another one. So the Leadership Institute went back and made another tie, and this is what they came up with, and this is the one I've got on. But I just find that story funny. In fact, I like wearing the tie so I can tell the story. But how often do you make it up to D.C. to be actually resident at Heritage? Or
Sure. So Heritage, by and large, is based on Capitol Hill. And part of the reason that Heritage is based on Capitol Hill is to interact with members of, certainly Congress, the House and the Senate, but also other folks who work in public policy in Washington. But increasingly, Heritage and its sister organization, Heritage Action, which is the C4 attached to Heritage, which is a C3, are focused on state policy issues because, as good Federalists, we recognize that many important policy issues are decided in state capitals, just like they are here in Montgomery as well. And so I spend a good bit of time, at least time every month, in Washington, D.C. Most of my colleagues are resident in Washington, D.C., but I'm fortunate enough to still be able to be in Pensacola, my hometown in Florida, a good bit of the time as well.
I think it's important for organizations like Heritage to have people in the little platoons out there in the heartland, out there in the country, to make sure that the organization stays honest and stays true to its principles. And I'm not speaking specifically about Heritage when I say that. I think all organizations that have a presence in D.C. would do well to have little pockets throughout the country and to enable their scholars or fellows to live in one place and commute and go back so that they don't lose sight of what the American experience is outside of that bubble.
Well, and I don't have to tell you or your viewers, Alan, but Washington, D.C. can be a very different place than the vast majority of America. And so it is good to get to come out and talk to folks like you, talk to folks in countries around, in cities around the country that do bring sometimes a different perspective than what you often hear among kind of the Beltway clique about what's, typical kind of talk in the Beltway at that time. And so I always appreciate the opportunity to get outside of the swamp of D.C., but I appreciate getting to spend time in the good swamp of Florida instead of the bad swamp of Washington.
Yeah, that's right, the dueling swamps. Well, you're 36 years old. You're a pretty young guy, despite what the beard may show, right? That you mentioned earlier you saw a little gray coming in on that beard.
Not exactly a spring chicken anymore either.
But you've done a lot for someone who's 36 years old. Do you have advice for other young people? I'd say college students. This is a program watched by many college students. It's a program of the Sorrell College of Business at Troy University. So we have students who watch this program, and a lot of the students are trying to figure out what it is they want to do with their lives. Some do want to go to law school. Some want to go get their MBA. Many of them have no idea what it is they want to do. Probably few of them could envision themselves by 36 accomplishing what you have accomplished. So I'm wondering if you have advice for those young people about careers, about what they might want to do to lead a fulfilling life.
Sure. Well, I've been very blessed. God has been very gracious to me and given me a lot of opportunities to pursue very interesting work in some very important and impactful fields, I think. And so I think fundamentally, obviously I'm a Christian. I bring a Christian worldview to what I do. I think it's important to pray about very important decisions and kind of follow where God leads in those areas. But it's also important to find something you enjoy doing as well. And so I very much like reading and writing, and I'm fortunate a lot of my work involves reading and writing and kind of staying abreast of current affairs. And so if you find something that you enjoy doing, that you're passionate about, and that can be impactful as well. And I think there are a lot of different ways to be impactful. And the way I hope that I can contribute now at the Heritage Foundation is different than how I contributed to our society as Assistant U.S. Attorney, or how I contributed when I was in private practice. But I think trying to do something you enjoy while at the same time serving your community, those are very good ideals to keep in mind.
When did you decide you were going to law school? I don't know the chronology. Did you go straight to the MA program and then straight to law school? Were there gaps? So you did.
I did. I went to undergrad started the MA while I was trying to decide if I wanted to go to law school, and then went straight through. Now, not everyone does that. My dad actually was a lawyer as well. He went back to law school very late in life. He was an engineer.
How old was he when he went back
He was
to
in
law
his mid to late 50s. He
Oh,
was
wow.
an engineer for 35 years, decided he wanted to practice law, went to Liberty University for law school, and then practiced law for many years.
Did he do patent work?
He did not. He was actually an estate and trust
really?
lawyer, and so a little bit of a different career path. But I think it goes to show, you're never too old to pursue a different line of work or to do something new. And I think it goes back to what we were talking about just a minute ago. There are many different ways to serve your community while doing something, hopefully, that you enjoy.
Well, that's interesting. Did you like law school? When you were in law school, did you enjoy it? That's one of those questions. I don't know how to interpret the laugh, because that could go many different ways.
I like the idea of law school.
Yeah.
I'll put it that way.
Yeah.
But obviously, look, your first year in law school is very stressful, very different from certainly anything I had done to that point.
It's a hazing ritual, basically, or
Well,
it was when we went through.
Well, it is to a certain extent, but just the method of teaching is different. You have more of the Socratic style where you ask questions. You're not necessarily reading a textbook saying this is what you need to know. You're reading cases and trying to glean the legal rule from it. And then your exam at the end of the semester. You don't really have, for most classes your first year, papers or quizzes or tests during the semester. Your entire grade is based on one exam at the end of the semester, where essentially you're given a hypothetical, a fact scenario, and being asked to issue spot, apply the rules that you were supposed to glean from these cases you read, and then apply them to this factual scenario, almost like you would in, I suppose, the real world to some extent if you're a lawyer faced with a certain situation. And so it's a very different experience, a very stressful one, to be perfectly honest. But at the end of the day, I do appreciate the fact that I did learn a lot during my time in law school, and certainly enjoyed getting to know my professors and my classmates during that time.
Yeah, I've always said studying law is learning applied philosophy. It's figuring out what all these ideas that we talk about at sort of an abstract level mean in a concrete, practical way.
Right.
And it's always interesting to me how, in particular, the common law tradition operates, in the sense that you have sort of innumerable judges depositing case after case, reasoning, rationale, and creating this textual network on which we can rely, so that we can have a record, sort of a record of human experience that guides us as we try to figure our way through complex issues that don't have easy answers.
That's right. Well, two interesting things I'll say about that, Alan, is, you're absolutely right. In law school, you do spend a lot of time thinking about the common law, because that's obviously our legal tradition that we inherited from England before we declared our independence as a country. And in the common law, you typically had judges finding the law, kind of applying these well-settled legal rules that everyone knew they existed, but maybe had never been formalized per se, and announcing kind of this new rule of law. Well, it's interesting because your first year of law, particularly in classes like torts and contracts, property, you spend a lot of time thinking about the common law. But in our society today, we aren't really a common law society in the way it was, in pre-revolutionary
Pre-Constitution,
Correct. Because today we're by and large governed by statutes, either at the state or the federal level, or to even a large extent at the local level with local ordinances. And so Justice Antonin Scalia made this point in one of his very well-known books when he wrote about kind of the role of judge and the role of judging, how it works, saying that, law students come out of law school with kind of this heady idea that judges make the law, or when really, find the law and apply the legal rule, when really their task at hand in their day-to-day work is very different. It primarily involves interpreting legal text, either the statutory text or the constitutional text, and applying that text to the real-world situations. And how a judge would approach that task, that interpretive task, is somewhat different than how a common law judge might have approached his task in applying the law at that time. And unfortunately, I think this conflation, this idea that judges are still common law judges to some extent, or this idea that judges are somehow philosopher kings free to impose their own view of what is a good rule or the most desirable rule, has led to some very bad judicial results and some of the decisions that I think were, frankly, some of the biggest abominations in our constitutional history. Decisions like Roe v. Wade, for example, where you had judges not really focusing on the text of the Constitution, but instead imposing their own view of what was good or moral or something along those lines.
Well, my last question for you, who are a couple of your legal heroes? You mentioned Scalia. Maybe he's one of them, but who are a couple of your legal heroes?
Well, I will say my father, because he is an excellent lawyer in his own right. But certainly Justice Antonin Scalia is very impactful in the way he thinks about the law. Certainly, along with Ed Meese, deserves a lot of credit, with Robert Bork as well, for reorienting the legal profession to focus on the text of statutes. But there are many, many others as well. But to be perfectly honest, Alan, I think lawyers who go about their everyday task of trying to fairly and impartially apply the law, prosecutors who are trying to do justice in their individual cases, they deserve a lot of credit for making our legal system and our society function as it should.
Well, I love that, Zach, and I really appreciate your coming on the show. I know you've got a trip back this afternoon to Florida, and we're going to have to get you on the road, but thank you for joining us. This has been Success Stories, a program of the Sorrell College of Business at Troy University. I'm Alan Mendenhall, signing off. Until next time.